Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start by saying that I'm really humbled sitting here next to a lot of people who I've read and learned a lot from, specifically Cynthia Ka, who's worked extensively on Dalit women's issues, and also Dr. Satya, who I've read, and of course Martin sir. I've heard about his work. I'm meeting him for the first time. So it's a really humbling experience, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I would like to start with a few disclaimers. One, which is that I didn't write that speaker's note, so my work does not focus on intersectionality, and I feel that it is impossible to talk about the trans experience without rooting it in caste patriarchy. And I think that it's my duty to talk about caste every time I talk about gender. So my specialization is not really that intersectionality thing that was read out. The other disclaimer that I wanted to make was that I have a little bit of a problem with the way in which this conference has been named as India's apartheid, right? Because apartheid is institutionally and legally enforced in South Africa, and it has a particular history. And to look at caste supremacy and the way that caste is practiced in India, of course there are similarities, but there are also huge differences, right? So here in India, you would see that the laws, thanks to Baba Saheb who framed the constitution, the laws are not rooted in caste patriarchy, right? Whereas in South Africa, it was legally also enforced. Here, there is a tension between caste morality and constitutional morality, which is what we see in the judiciary, and of course, as law students, all of you would be aware of that. The other difference, of course, there are people, and I agree with them, who say that race is also a mythical construct, because there are more variations within a single race of people than between races. But of course, the systems that oppression that emerge out of a race supremacist world, that is of course not mythical. So in a similar way, Baba Sahib has of course said that caste is the division of a single race of people, and there is no biological basis for that. And even the black scholar Du Bois, he's talked about the double consciousness of how the world sees you and how you see yourself. So I think in the examples that were talked about by Dr. Satya as well, that double consciousness of how you see yourself and how the world sees you and how the world treats you, I think that's very useful for us to analyze both caste as well as the trans experience. Because of course the trans experience necessarily means a disconnect with how you see yourself and how the world sees you. So the other thing that I wanted to also mention was that in the concept note there was a portion where it said the hidden apartheid of India. I mean, I have to say that there is nothing hidden about caste supremacy. I think we are openly and shamelessly caste supremacist, and I think that's something that we need to accept and acknowledge. Accept in terms of the fact that this is a reality, accept not as in terms of let it be. Of course, we have to do everything within our capacity to change that. So, just like Dr. Satya said, apart from the historical ways in which caste has been utilized, recently you would see, like even on social media, the ways in which technology is being used. Earlier they would, use chappals as a garland around statues and symbols of anti-caste movements, but now they're using memes. So caste itself is morphing itself into modernity, and new ways of being castes are being found every day. So I think the resistance also has to use those same technologies to fight against that. So now coming to the topic that has been given, intersectionality, as most of you would know, was a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 to refer to specifically those intersecting identities of gender, race, ethnicity, etc., which compounds a person's experience of structural exclusion or discrimination. So if you look at it historically, even before 1989, I mean that's the date at which they pinned down intersectionality, right? But if you look at Sojourner Truth, the well-known abolitionist at the Women's Convention in Ohio in 1851, said, and I quote, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have ploughed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of all sold off to slavery, and when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" So you see in 1851 in Ohio, there's a black woman, an African American woman, who's talking about race as well as gender, because In the women's convention, they're talking about how women should be respected and adult suffrage and all of that movement is happening. And she's talking specifically about race slavery and what she's made to do. And she's questioning whether she's not a woman. So you see that intersectional analysis has happened much before it has come into critical theory and the lived realities and the work that people have done before that. And of course, Laverne Cox, the African-American trans woman, has referred to the speech of Sojourner Truth in 2015, and you can find it on YouTube. It's called The Entire Woman, because she refers to her own position as a black trans woman and the kind of experiences that she has, and she refers to this historical speech by Sojourner Truth. In early 20th century, when Ayangali mobilized in Neyyattingara in Kerala, for Dalit women to give up their symbols of slavery, those granite necklaces and those stone, jewelry. He was talking about women's liberation, right? So anti-caste work historically has included the gender question. It has intrinsically been part of anti-caste movements, whether you look at the Hindu Code Bill that was introduced by Baba Saheb, whether it is the 1907 first agricultural revolution that happened in Kerala, right? The communist history, of course, appropriates a lot of this Ayangali struggle and says it was an agrarian revolution, whereas some of the main demands were admitting Dalit students into schools, the right to schooling, the right to public passage, and also protesting against the false cases that were put on Dalits in that village. So all of these issues came within the scope of the first agrarian revolt, and of course it was not just about the land issue, it was always linked to social and economic dignity. And that's something that is constantly erased by communist histories in Kerala. In a caste-based economy, of course, when a caste decides what occupation you will have, and it tries to fix your occupation and hereditarily at that, then it's in the framework of class analysis, you can say that it's a caste-based economy. And any anti-caste movement that looks at the caste question will necessarily involve the working class, because caste occupation is fixed. And the working class, the most vulnerable sections of the working class will be, will belong to oppressed caste backgrounds. So, whereas the opposite of that, where a communist politics or a left politics, where the caste question is not considered, it can be quite disastrous. As we have seen in JNU, I studied in JNU, and there was this one incident that happened where most of the leftist students would try to organize among the workers on campus. Right, so there was an issue with the Safai Karamchari workers, and they were not being given, there was a lot of backlog of pay that had not come to them. They were not given basic equipment to pick up the trash. So there was an action that was planned by the leftist dominant caste students, where the workers were asked to go on strike. But the mess workers didn't go on strike because the mess workers didn't belong to Dalit backgrounds. Of course, the food that is cooked for the elite dominant caste students in JNU has to be cooked by the dominant caste, right? So there was a caste division within the working class, right? And this is something that the left students could not even foresee, and because of this, 44 Safai Karmacharis lost their jobs, and of course the dominant caste mess workers kept their jobs. So it can be quite disastrous to not look at the caste equation within the working class, and this is also something that Dr. Ambedkar has already mentioned in his critique of how socialism works. So I would like to make legible my own positions, because usually you see that in such conferences, my note, my bio does not reveal my caste. I have the privilege of hiding behind my caste. That's really the hidden aspect of caste, I would say. The fact that dominant caste can hide our caste and be casteless. And there are similarities in the way in which the white people in US, hide their privileges and say that we are all human beings. So my background is I was raised by a Savarna mother in Kerala. So my caste background is Savarna, and I belong to a dominant caste background. I'm a trans man, I'm a heterosexual trans man, and I was raised by my single mothers. So I had a middle class upbringing, and I'm university educated. So these are the various identities that I embody. And I think the fact that I'm here, talking on a panel on intersectionality, when there are other trans men from Adivasi Dalit backgrounds struggling with disabilities who have not been invited, the fact that I'm speaking here is a symbol of my privilege as well. So I would like to acknowledge that while speaking. Now, specifically, if you look at the experiences of caste and trans communities, you would see that similar to how caste is hereditary and occupationally fixed, there is this way in which traditionally trans women, specifically hijras, always go into either sex work or begging. And Living Smile Vidya, who is my co-artist in Panmai Theatre, of course, she has said that begging and sex work have almost become like caste occupations for the Hijra community, because they cannot see beyond those two options. It's almost like if you join the Hijra system, you have to get into these occupations. And of course, both these occupations you can see in terms of purity and pollution where they stand. So the trans woman across caste, that I think is one of the only categories that you would see in sex work, where across caste you would see trans women, whereas if you look at cisgender women, you would see more, a majority of them would be Dalit Bahujan caste, because of the structural exclusions that they face and the economic necessity that they structure that you see within the NGO structure. But of course, you have to admit that given that these other begging and sex work are the other options, the NGOs, though they work on a feudal setup, they do give a semblance of dignity to a trans person who wakes up in the morning and can go to office just like everyone else. So that cannot be dismissed, but it still needs to be fought out at that level where the feudal structure of NGOs need to be challenged, and that will happen only if they accept the leadership of people whose issues they're receiving funding for. The other example that I would like to give is, of course, everybody knows about the Devdasi slavery system. I don't call it a tradition because tradition is a very mild word. You keep saying it's part of our tradition and heritage. Whose tradition and whose heritage, right? So it is based on caste-based sexual slavery, and similar to that, there are young boys from Dalit and also lower-class Muslim families in Andhra, South Maharashtra, as well as North Karnataka, who are dedicated to goddess Yellama in a similar fashion, and that community is called Jogtas or Jogapas. And that's also something that is currently being included as part of the trans spectrum. So we have a lot of Jogtas and Jogapas who are part of our movement, but also because of the ways in which, similar to how the sex work debate has been framed as choice or choicelessness, the trans debates or the discourse has been framed around, self-identification or choice, right? So Jogtas are, though they are, newly entering the trans communities, there is no analysis over what results in them being dedicated to goddess Yellama, whether they're choosing it at the age of 10 or 14, or whether it is part of the caste slavery. And NGOs also don't allow you to put forward the analysis, because they need to find the Jogtas so that they can get the exotic research-based fellowship. Now they're getting fellowship for Jogtas because it's part of the tradition according to them, right? So it sounds more exotic to white people, and they'll give funding for that. So these are the ways in which they construct and create and perpetuate these myths, and do not allow us to talk really about what it is rooted in. And if you look at the laws that are used against the trans community, a lot of you might know that in November 2014, 53 trans women were picked up from the streets and taken to beggars colony, right? So if you look at the Karnataka Prohibition of Beggary Act, the only exceptions to that act are religious mendicants. Religious mendicants are free to beg and loot the rest of them. This is part of the caste system, right? Brahmins have historically looted and done the mumbo jumbo Vedas, Upanishads, and they are continuing this through the Karnataka Prohibition of Beggary Act. So the trans women, the street-based vendors, all these people who are doing street-based labor, the impure and polluted presence in the public space, they need to be cleaned up. And this is part of the caste purificatory ritual that they're doing, picking up these people and either destroying their vending machines or taking them to beggars colony. This is part of the public space being purified by the stooges of the caste supremacist administration, right? So the police is the hand for them to perpetuate all of these acts. The other act that is used is the Karnataka Police Act 36A, in which it is modeled on the Criminal Tribes Act. So the police station is allowed to keep a register of all the hijras in their particular locality. Why? So that by the end of the month, if there are some cases that are not solved, you can just match some names to those cases, or you can use it. Basically, it's a surveillance tool that can be used to harass the trans community at any time. And the Criminal Tribes Act, as all of you know, even someone like Jawaharlal Nehru admitted, that it has to go. So clearly, if Nehru has admitted, it should have gone 1,000 years back maybe, right? So the trans community is still facing this kind of criminalization on the basis of their gender identity. So if you look at how a trans person is disowned by families, I have been lucky in some sense. Across caste, trans people are disowned from their families, and one of the reasons is, what will the neighbors say, or caste respectability or shame. Shame is of course rooted in caste patriarchy. Why should you feel ashamed about a child who wants to assert a different gender? So the fact that all of these questions you can trace all of these questions and root it back in caste. And I think that it's important for the trans movement to really become sharper in terms of anti-caste analysis, because that's the only way that we can liberate ourselves from this. So even if you look at the figure of a trans person, how is it portrayed in films? Of course, trans men, because nobody knows about us, we are not yet been portrayed in films. So I think that imagization has been historically good for us, because at least there are no negative stereotypes about us. But trans women, because they are hyper visibilized in most of the films or mainstream culture, you would see that she is a hyper sexualized creature, right? And who's always engaged in immoral activities, right? The object of mockery or fear. These are the stereotypes that you would find about trans women. And this is really how, this, in linguistics you would say that the word is created through binaries, and you other to have the center as pure. So the trans woman, the impure trans woman who's engaged in these immoral activities, who's hypersexualized, is always the perpetual other, and the center will be the good Savarna woman who endogamously marries, and has beautiful babies endogenously, and will transfer her property endogenously, right? So the center remains fixed, and against the center, all of these categories will be defined: the Dalit woman, the trans woman across caste. All of these peripheral identities are retained so that the center can be stable. And I think for the center to be destabilized, the push will really come from the periphery, and that's really what we are seeing right now. Right, from all of these movements, the push is coming, and finally, dominant caste feminists are saying, yeah, we must organize a conference on caste. We must include. Right? So even if you look at the medical field is completely destroyed by Hinduism. I'll give you some examples. Recently, I went to an endocrinologist. Of course, a lot of people might be curious about what this whole process of transitioning is. I mean, you can ask me after this. I'm fine answering those questions, or you can catch me later if you're embarrassed and you think it's an offensive question. You can ask me in private, right? So in the medical establishments, you would see that the endocrinologist, for example, who I go to, she says, we are messing with God. I said, which God? Which God are you talking about? Right? And then the nurses don't give you the injection because it's an oil-based injection. It really hurts for 2-3 days after you take it. And I have to take it every 3 months for the rest of my life. So the nurses all run away when I go and get the injection. And they say, no, you will go home and curse me when it hurts. So that entire thing where, science has to be based, science in India, we know what it's based on, right? It's a Brahmanic knowledge production process. There is no critical inquiry, there is no critical analysis that happens within pure sciences, and it's a pure Iyengar enterprise, right? So just go to IASC, you will see how Iyer and Iyengar ties are in enterprise, right? So the medical, this thing is also completely infested by this caste colonization, the doctors, the nurses, everybody. And I have to say the nurses have done fantastic work. I think they are the most unrecognized in the health sector, and of course within the grade of nurses itself there's a feudal this thing where the ones who wear the dark blue, of course the symbol of the anti-caste movement, will be the lowest rung workers there and who are paid the least, and they will be in charge of the impure activities again, cleaning up, taking the trash, all of that stuff, right? So within these sectors you will see how feudal the division on the basis of one single labor, nurses one single category, but within that category you will see the feudal divisions. So in 1881 the imperial census classified hijras in Berar under the title hijra and included them under the category of a mendicant and vagrant caste. Whereas in Bombay, they were listed as a caste of dancers and musical instrument players. And in central provinces, the Hijras were included under the caste category of singers and dancers at birth and